ProPokemon videos are sponsored by the ProPokemon store. Brand new articles have just been released for the starter battle roads. Find out the top 5 decks for battle roads with Jack Armstead, including a deck list and detailed analysis on each deck. Learn to counter Pokemon Catcher through Trainer Lock with a range of ideas, deck lists and analysis from Alex Fields. Stage 1 variants are hyped to be the best deck in the format. Get all the information and all the best variants along with deck lists with John Kettler. All articles are just $2.99 each or $7.49 if you buy 3 in one go. There's a lot of content available, especially on the internet, which tells you how to become a good player. It tells you to make your decks more consistent, to always play the best decks available to you, and how to generally avoid misplays. However, nobody's really covered how the great players become world-class players, and rather than having lots of big changes, it's often the smaller details which make these players stand out from everybody else. In this video I'm going to cover what these small details are and things you can work to improve on within your game to try and make you a better player. Knowing what's in the opponent's hand is one of the biggest advantages you can get when playing the Pokemon trading card game. Now, although you can't actually see what's in there unless you use a specific card like Mr. Mime, through a good memory and concentration you can often figure it out. Now, a lot of cards like Pokemon Communication or Junk Arm make the opponent have to show you the card before they put it into your hand. All you have to do is remember every card like this which goes into their hand and then tick it off in your mind once they play down the card. I'm going to use an example here where I have 6 face down cards which we're going to assume is the opponent's hand. Perhaps in this game, if you weren't paying attention, you wouldn't know what any of those 6 cards are. Now with this 6 card hand, it's possible that your opponent could have many possibilities from which they could play energy, trainers, supporters, Pokemon, or anything really within that hand. However, if you were keeping track, you might have noticed that the first 2 cards were basic Pokemon. You know this because they play down the Pokemon Collector, but because they only had one bench spot available on their bench, they only play down one of the Pokemon, and so you know that the first 2 cards in their hand are Yanma. Now you also notice that during their last turn, they play down 2 Phanpy onto the bench. Now Donphan isn't too important in this matchup, and you know they wouldn't have played them down without good reason, so you can safely guess that the 3rd card in their hand is a Donphan Prime. Now the 4th card, if you remembered, was a Pokemon Catcher. Now the opponent played a Junk Arm on their last turn, discarded 2 cards and put it back into their hand, but decided not to play it down. Now we have the remaining last 2 cards. You remember that the opponent didn't play an energy down in their last turn, and you suspect that it's because they didn't have an energy in hand. So we can safely assume that these 2 cards are probably trainers or Pokemon, because if they had an energy then they would have just played it down. Now suddenly, by paying attention, you know a large majority of your opponent's hand. You can find out their strengths and their weaknesses, and from that what they're likely to do in the next few turns. Now the one problem with this is that in this format a lot of people like shuffle and draw supporters, which constantly resets what you're having to remember. However, regardless of this, it's still a very important aspect of the game, and by paying attention and trying to concentrate, it can give you a huge advantage. My next tip is pretty similar to the last, and it involves just reading what your opponent's doing in general, thinking about every small detail, thinking about what they should have played. If they didn't, then why didn't they play it, and just trying to assess what their general strategy and board position is. Now, I want to give an example of this to make it more clear. At the London State Championships last year, I played against Sammy Sakoum using a Saberlock deck as opposed to my Luxray Garchomp deck. Now, for those of you who are around then, Saberlock tried to lock the opponent's hand, and so it was pretty important to know what they had in hand, so you could know if they were able to get out of the lock. Now, I was locked into this position and then had a hand of 2 cards. One was a Garchomp C, which I'd used an Aaron's collection on, and the other was unknown to Sammy, but to me I knew it as an energy gain, which I'd just drawn into naturally. However, Sammy looked at me and said, "Tell me after the game, but I believe that's an energy gain." And surprise, surprise, it was. Now, I had no idea how Sammy could have known this, and I asked him after the game if I'd accidentally flashed it to him while it was in my hand or something, and he told me that he'd gone through every single card that a standard Luxray plays, and Energy Game was the only card which I wouldn't have played down. This shows you how just paying attention to small details and going through every minuscule thing can give you a huge advantage, which sometimes is all you need to see out a close game. Next up is remembering that there are 4 ways to win a Pokemon card game, not just one. Now, a lot of people and games just usually end when one person draws 6 prizes. However, benching the opponent, declaring yourself the winner with Lost World, and the opponent decking out are 3 other ways in which you can win a game. Now, for those of you who watch the Top Cut Invitational on YouTube, you could have seen an example of this when Yamato played Sammy. Now, Yamato had 2 prizes left to Sammy's 1, and knew that Sammy could win next turn, and that he couldn't win by drawing 6 prizes before Sammy. So instead he noticed that Sammy's deck was low, and counted Sammy's hand count. From this he realised that if he played a judge, Sammy would be forced to draw every card remaining in his deck, and then when Yamato ended his turn, Sammy wouldn't have a card to draw, and thus Yamato would declare himself the winner. Now, unfortunately, this great play didn't work because he miscalculated the card that Sammy drew from his prizes when he knocked out Yamato's Pokemon, and Sammy had the 1 card available to draw into and finish his turn. My next example is similar to the last, but instead of remembering ways to win a game, remembering that you have some Pokemon within your deck that have attacks that might be useful in certain situations. At the World Championships in 2009, Steven Silvestro had a really rough start with Beedrill Luxray, and was in a position where if he lost this game, he wouldn't be able to top cut. His opponent had a Palkia G level X active and was able to take their last prize on the turn coming up once Steven ended his. However, Steven couldn't take the last prize either, and he needed a turn to prepare himself to do this. He thought about all the options within his deck and remembered that Weedle had an attack which, if he flipped heads, would paralyse the opponent's Pokemon for 1 turn. He knew that the opponent had used all of their Poke Turn, and remember this was in a format where Junkam hadn't been released yet. He searched out a Weedle, benched it, attached an energy, retreated, and made one of the most important coin flip of his life, flipping heads and paralysing their Pokemon. This meant that Steven was able to win that game, and after not dropping 1 game since, went on to win the World Championships. Next up is maths, and probability to be exact. Now remember that none of my equations are strictly accurate, I'm just showing a rough way of working out, which you're able to use in tournaments where you're not allowed a calculator to work it out properly. Now let's assume that we have a 30 card deck, and within that there are 3 cards we need that give us the out to win the game. Because of that, we know that there's roughly 1 card which we need per 10 cards in our deck. Now we know that Sage's Training goes through 5 cards, so from that we can work out that roughly Sage's Training has about a 50% chance of getting the card we need to win the game. While on the subject of probability, I also want to mention that the best players always try and go for the safe option, the one which gives them the best chance of letting something happen rather than a small chance of having something amazing happen. Try to never go down strategy routes which offer a poor chance for actually coming off, unless you're in a really bad ball position and you feel that that's your only way you can win the game. My next and final tip isn't just true for Pokemon, but anything competitive which you participate in. It's important to remember that it's always very important to play against better players than yourself, or at least those on a similar level. The worst thing you can do is test against bad players and get complacent in your playing style and not try and push yourself further. By playing against good players, you can experience losses and analyse why you lost them, and try and improve your game and pick it up so you have a better chance in those similar situations in the future. Having good players is also important, because of having good friends within the game means you have access to many more ideas, deck lists, and you can generally talk about strategy between yourself and offer different opinions on a topic which you might not have thought of before. So those are my tips for trying to turn yourself from a good player into a world-class player. Now, I don't claim for myself to be a world-class player, but these are tips which I try and work on every time I play the Pokemon card game to try and improve myself as a player. Thanks for watching, please give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more great Pokemon videos.